Putin has for 20 years been dumping money into building up a military that looks wonderful when it parades through Red Square and is fine when it's bullying much, much smaller neighbors like Georgia. But basically that 20 years of military modernization has largely been blasted in 20 weeks of war fighting.
What does winning look like from a Ukrainian side and from a Russian side?
Well, to a large extent, it's going to be determined by what happens on the battlefield. I think Putin would be delighted, frankly, if he could consolidate his grip on the Donbass region overall and maintain this land corridor to Crimea. That's certainly something that, although it's nowhere near what he'd originally intended with this sort of total takeover of Ukraine, but it's something that he could definitely spin as a victory. Whether he'd get that is another matter. As for the Ukrainians, this is the interesting thing. Are they going to be willing to just push back to the pre-invasion lines? Will they want to take over all of Donbass, including the sort of so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk? And would they even go for Crimea, which are all annexed in 2014? The point is that I think the Ukrainians haven't fixed on a position, because that's the sensible thing to do. They're seeing what the situation will be. But the trouble is, at the moment, they're just so far apart that there's not even the possibility of any meaningful peace talks.
And then, of course, we have the role of the West. And your article in the Sunday Times is called, "Is the West really prepared to pay the price of defeating Putin?" What is that price?
Well, I think this is it. We have to accept that if this is something that we are determined to do, and so far that's what our political leaderships are saying, but nonetheless, it's going to be a long slog. I think there was a very early initial triumphalism that, we'll slap on economic sanctions and Putin will see that he's, going to have to pull back. And of course, he's not going to. For Putin, this is an existential struggle for him, if nothing else. If he actually is defeated in Ukraine, first of all, that means that his historic legacy, which is something that we know is very important to him, is going to be as a loser. Secondly, his political position and possibly his whole future will very much be in the question. So, we have to acknowledge that we've decided to basically fight a non-kinetic war with Russia. In other words, we don't have our boys fighting and dying on the front line. Instead, we are fighting through the economy, through culture, through politics, because these are areas in which we have real strengths. But look, like any wars, these have costs. And my big concern is that in the West, there hasn't really been a willingness for our leaders to be open with electorates and also with each other about the need to decide what it is we're really looking for. And more to the point, what are we willing to pay as the price? And if we don't, my big concern is that maybe it's going to be a hard winter, almost certainly, with fuel prices high and still haven't properly recovered from COVID, etc. And when we have, again, this talk of, for example, this 1 billion of more additional assistance that Britain is providing, which obviously is vastly appreciated by the Ukrainians, but it's the cost of building 2 new hospitals at home. I think people have to be aware that even if they think, yes, we want to support the Ukrainians, are they also willing to accept the other costs associated with it?
I guess the other cost is if the UK and indeed other Western nations decided to stop supporting Ukraine at some point in the future, what is the cost of that? And potentially Russia pushing on into other nations and further down the line creating an even bigger headache for the European continent.
I will be honest, I don't actually think that's likely.
Really?
The Ukrainians have basically ripped the guts out of Russia's much vaunted military machine. Putin has for 20 years been dumping money into building up a military that looks wonderful when it parades through Red Square and is fine when it's bullying much, much smaller neighbors like Georgia. But basically that 20 years of military modernization has largely been blasted in 20 weeks of war fighting. Now, obviously, the Ukrainians are also taking terrible losses too, so there's no guarantees that they can sort of win or even sort of push back on the battlefield. But I think we have to acknowledge the degree to which actually Russia will have to spend a long time rebuilding its military, and will have to do so in a circumstance of massive economic problems because of sanctions. So, again, I think at the moment it always seems wrong to be saying anything sort of almost optimistic about the situation. I think the risks we face are two. Not of the Russians then thinking, let's go into, attack Poland or somewhere, because they're not going to mess with NATO. Rather, it's first of all, the Russians will use non-kinetic means against us. And that's the kind of war we've started. We can expect more in the way of subversion, sabotage, maybe even support for terrorism and the like. But secondly, that if we show that we are weak and divided and ultimately play into Putin's own assumptions that we are basically an attention deficit disorder society, that we can't basically hold the same priority for longer than a few weeks or months, well, it inspires all the other would-be revanchists, whether we're talking about China or wherever else, to think, look, the West talks a big game, but ultimately will not follow through.
Both Harry York and Larissa Brown have written in the Sunday Times today the fact that UK weapons stocks are being really hit by the amount that are being handed over to Ukraine because you can't replenish stocks as quickly as you can hand them over. That's going to be something playing on the minds, just not of the UK government, but also governments in the West. And there are very different positions, aren't there, from different countries? I'm even just thinking UK, France, Germany, US.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think this is really the fundamental problem, that everyone's rhetoric is the same, but the reality behind the rhetoric varies dramatically between countries. Look, for some countries, and particularly, one can understand why. It's the countries that border onto Russia are obviously much more bullish. And for them, this is not just simply about pushing back Russian forces in Ukraine. It's about degrading Russia's capacities enough that it could not launch another such war. And then there are others, and one has to look at Berlin, but also to a degree Paris, where you suspect that actually their real goal is, we just would like this war to go away. It's expensive, it's inconvenient, we want to have other priorities. So, what can we do to push it back to the point where there can be a sort of a reasonable deal? But when it comes to the military stocks, which is a really important point, I mean, look, again, we have to be realistic. It's not actually as if all of a sudden we're going to just run out of weapons. However, it is something that we need to consider. And that comes back to, again, the costs. I mean, we've got Ben Wallace saying that we need to be spending 2.5% of GDP on defense. And that's probably a minimum, frankly, for the kind of uncertain future security environment. But the point is, we also need to be looking very much at short-term measures, exactly to see how we can try and fill that shortfall. Otherwise, yes, we will end up in a situation in which in 5 or 10 years' time, we're going to have great new kit. But in the meantime, we're scrabbling around desperately looking for secondhand stocks.